Okay, so when I was living in China, one thing I couldn't help but notice was just how easy it was to get around without even owning a car. But coming back to the United States, I started wondering, why does building major infrastructure feel so much harder here? So what exactly is China doing differently? And what can America realistically learn from it? So this isn't something you really understand from news headlines. It's something you notice when you actually spend time in China. In China, infrastructure is everywhere. Fast rail connections, expanding subway systems, entire new districts taking shape. And when you come back to the United States, the contrast shows up in how cities connect and grow. That difference becomes especially clear when you look at how people actually move between major cities. So China now has the world's largest high-speed rail network. Traveling between major cities without a car is completely normal there, even across very long distances. For many Americans visiting China for the first time, that experience can feel almost futuristic. You can go from one massive city to another quickly, comfortably, and often without needing a car at all. In the United States, long distance travel still depends heavily on cars and planes. And what makes this comparison especially interesting is that America actually used to build infrastructure at this kind of scale too. So one reason China's infrastructure boom stands out is because the United States once built at that same level. When people see China's massive train stations and rapid construction, it feels like a glimpse of the future. But America once had its own era of large-scale building: the interstate highway system, the Hoover Dam, massive bridges, major airports. There was a time when the United States regularly built projects that reshaped how the country functioned. So the real question isn't capability. It's why that level of ambition feels so much rarer today. And part of the answer starts with long-term planning. In China, major infrastructure projects are often treated as long-term national priorities that continue across decades. In the United States, projects can be slowed by political changes, funding disputes, legal challenges, and local opposition. And over time, even relatively straightforward projects can take much longer to move from planning to completion. That difference starts to connect to how decisions about infrastructure actually get made. And that leads into a bigger question: how do these systems actually get funded? But China's massive building of infrastructure came with enormous amounts of debt, much are through local government financing that help fund projects outside the main budget system. And China does have financial problems and real estate issues, including developments that have filled up over time and others that remain underused. But when people look at China, they can usually see where a huge amount of that borrowing went. In the United States, the national debt is also very large, yet many people feel like the visible infrastructure around them hasn't changed at the same pace. And that contrast is part of why this comparison keeps coming up. But of course, these systems operate very differently, and that shapes how quickly things actually get built. So China and the United States have fundamentally different political systems. China's more centralized structure allows projects to move quickly, but that also comes with trade-offs most Americans wouldn't accept, including less ability for local communities to push back, less transparency, and a higher risk of misallocated projects. At the same time, that structure also changes how decisions get made and how quickly large projects can actually move forward. So when you strip away the political layer, what's left are patterns in execution and speed that are still worth understanding. So one of the most noticeable differences is how quickly projects move. In China, entire subway systems, rail lines, and new districts can take shape in a relatively short time. Part of that comes down to how infrastructure is prioritized, but also the sheer technical capacity behind it. China produces a large number of engineers and construction specialists who directly feed into large-scale infrastructure projects. In the United States, major projects often spend years in planning before construction even begins. And when they do move forward, coordination is often more fragmented across different agencies and levels of government. But speed and capacity don't tell the full story, because another major factor is what it actually costs and what gets approved in the first place. So America doesn't just build slowly, it often builds very expensively. Some infrastructure projects cost significantly more per mile than comparable projects elsewhere, and part of that comes down to how projects are evaluated. In the United States, large infrastructure has to pass through extensive cost-benefit analysis, regulation, legal review, and expectations of long-term financial justification. That makes it difficult for ambitious projects like high-speed rail to move forward unless they clearly make economic sense. So they often get delayed, scaled down, or never built at all. The result is a tendency to underbuild. In China, infrastructure is more closely tied to long-term development goals, connecting regions, expanding capacity, supporting growth. That approach allows rapid expansion, but can also lead to overbuilding, where infrastructure is created faster than is fully utilized. Two very different outcomes. One struggles to build enough, the other sometimes builds too much. And these differences start to show up in how each country thinks about infrastructure as a national priority. In China, infrastructure often feels directly tied to national development and long-term growth. There's a visible sense of momentum, with constant expansion and new connections between regions. In many cities, you can physically see how quickly transportation networks in urban areas are continuing to evolve. In the United States, infrastructure is often more reactive, discussed when something breaks or becomes a problem, and because projects can take so long to approve and complete, that can create the feeling that visible progress happens very slowly. That difference in mindset affects how consistently infrastructure projects are pursued over time. And once you start looking at how each country developed, the differences become even more understandable. So the United States and China are also operating under very different conditions. America developed much earlier and is far more suburban and car dependent. In China, a lower share of people rely on cars in the same way, especially in major urban areas, and many cities were designed around dense housing and strong public transit systems. That makes large-scale rail and subway systems much more practical as a default way of getting around. China also urbanized rapidly in a relatively short period, which allowed for large-scale modern infrastructure planning. So the comparison isn't one-to-one, but even with those differences, the gap in visible construction is still something many people notice immediately, and over time, that visible difference can start to shape how people think about progress itself. One thing many people notice in China is a sense that the country is actively building toward the future. And whether someone agrees with China's system or not, that constant construction creates a very visible sense of progress. In the United States, many people instead feel surrounded by aging infrastructure and slower development. And over time, that shapes how people think about progress and national confidence. It also changes expectations, especially for younger generations growing up in very different physical environments. And once you start looking at those differences side by side, it naturally raises a question of what lessons, if any, can actually be applied elsewhere. The United States is obviously not going to become China, but there are still practical lessons worth considering. Long-term planning that survives election cycles, streamlined approval processes that still maintain oversight, better coordination between federal, state, and local agencies, procurement reform, including more fixed-price contracts, and stronger accountability for delays, and the ability to actually complete large-scale infrastructure projects once they are started. I am not suggesting that we copy China's political system, but we have to find ways to get things done again in America. And ultimately, all this points to a much bigger question about what modern societies are still capable of building. When you look at China's infrastructure, it forces a simple but uncomfortable comparison, not just about what gets built, but how quickly societies are able to turn plans in reality. It raises questions like, what would it look like if a major US city could build a new subway line in 5 years instead of 15, or if connecting two major cities by rail didn't take decades of studies before construction even began. These aren't easy questions, and there aren't simple answers, but they matter because infrastructure shapes how countries grow, move, and function over time. And ultimately, it comes down to this: what a country is able to build and how quickly it believes it can build its future. And thank you so much, everybody, for watching this video. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have many more videos coming just like this one. And thanks again, everybody, and I'll see all of you for the next time.